They say that the eyes are the window to the soul, but I have always found that to be a clumsy metaphor, because eyes can lie, and smiles can be faked, and postures can be rehearsed. But the scent a person carries never deceives. My name is Helena Mercer, and for 40 years I served as the primary nose for one of the most prestigious perfume houses in Paris. And I learned early on that fear smells like vinegar, and greed smells like cold copper, and betrayal smells sickeningly sweet, like rotting lilies. I had retired to the rugged coast of Oregon to escape those scents. I wanted nothing more than the clean salt air of the Pacific and the crisp green aroma of the Douglas firs that lined my driveway and the soothing herbal drift from my lavender garden. I had built a sanctuary here on the edge of the cliffs where the only drama was the crashing of the waves against the rocks below, and the only visitors were the seagulls that circled the gray sky. But that peace shattered on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I was on my knees in the garden pruning the last of the English lavender before the frost set in and the air was thick with that dusty purple calmness that I loved so much. I heard the car before I saw it, and the engine did not sound like the heavy rumble of the delivery truck or the polite hum of Elias Thorne's sedan. This was a sports car engine whining and revving, as if the driver were fighting the winding gravel road rather than respecting it. I stood up and brushed the soil from the knees of my canvas trousers and watched as a sleek red convertible drifted around the final bend and crunched to a halt in front of my porch. The engine cut, and the silence rushed back in. But it felt thinner now and fragile. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a young man who looked like a magazine advertisement for a life of leisure. He wore a cashmere sweater, the color of oatmeal, and dark denim jeans and leather loafers that had never seen a day of work. It took me a moment to reconcile the face with the memory of the scrawny boy I had last seen 10 years ago at my brother's funeral, but there was no mistaking the Mercer jawline and the restless eyes. It was my nephew, Gavin. I stayed by the lavender bush and waited for him to come to me because I wanted to read the wind before he could speak. He spotted me and waved and flashed a smile that was bright and practiced, and he jogged over the grass with an energy that felt frantic. He called out my name and said he hoped he wasn't interrupting anything, and before I could answer, he had pulled me into a hug that lasted 3 seconds too long. That was when the story told itself to me. He pulled back and told me that I looked wonderful and that the sea air must be good for me, but I was barely listening to his words because my nose was dissecting the invisible cloud around him. On the surface, he smelled of an expensive bergamot cologne likely purchased at the duty-free shop at the airport. Beneath that was the stale cling of recycled airplane air and the faint chemical residue of dry cleaning fluid. But deeper down under the layers of luxury was the truth. I smelled stale tobacco smoke that had been scrubbed from his hands but lingered in his hair, and I smelled the unmistakable sour metallic tang of adrenaline. It is a scent distinct from nervous sweat because it is sharper and more acidic. It is the smell of a hunted animal. I asked him what he was doing here so far from the city and the lights he loved so much. He laughed and ran a hand through his hair and said that he just wanted to reconnect because family should not be strangers, and he had been thinking about his father and realized I was the only link he had left to the past. He said he needed a break from the hustle of New York and thought a few days with his favorite aunt would be good for his soul. I looked at his shoes and noticed the leather was scuffed at the toe, and there was a fine layer of red dust on the heel that did not match the gray gravel of my driveway. He had been walking somewhere recently that wasn't paved. I told him he was welcome to stay for dinner, But I did not offer him the guest room immediately because I wanted to see how he would react to the uncertainty. He nodded too quickly and said dinner would be lovely, and he looked over my shoulder at the large Victorian house looming against the gray sky. I saw his eyes dart to the second-floor windows and then back to me, and for a split second, the charming smile dropped, and I saw the calculation in his face. He picked up his leather weekender bag from the passenger seat of the convertible, and I noticed his knuckles were white as he gripped the handle. I led him toward the front door, and the wind shifted coming off the ocean and carrying the scent of the incoming storm. I unlocked the heavy oak door and ushered him inside, and as he passed me, the scent hit me again. It was faint but undeniable. It was the smell of old paper and binding glue, the smell of archives. Gavin had not come here for fresh air or family bonding or a break from the city. He had been researching. He had been digging. And as the heavy door clicked shut behind us, trapping the two of us in the dim hallway, I realized that my quiet retirement was over. The wolf was not at the door anymore. He was standing in my foyer, and he was wearing a cashmere sweater. I roasted a chicken with 40 cloves of garlic and sprigs of fresh rosemary because it is a dish that demands patience, and I wanted to see if Gavin possessed any. The kitchen was warm and filled with the savory and grounding aroma of roasting meat and caramelized vegetables, which is usually a scent that brings people together. But tonight, it felt like a barrier I was erecting between us. Gavin sat at the heavy oak table in the dining room, and he had opened a bottle of Pinot Noir that I had been saving for a special occasion. He poured the wine with a hand that was steady, but his eyes were jumping around the room like trapped moths, assessing the value of the paintings on the walls and the silver candlesticks on the sideboard. I brought the platter out and set it down, and the steam rose up between us, and for a moment he looked like the little boy he used to be before the world, and his own bad choices had hardened him. He complimented the food with words that were too flowery and too loud for the empty room, and he ate quickly, as if he were afraid someone might take the plate away. I watched him over the rim of my wine glass, and I took small sips and let the silence stretch out, because silence is a powerful tool that forces liars to fill the void. And fill it he did. He started talking about the family name and how it was a tragedy that the Mercer brand had faded into obscurity since my father passed and since I retired. He spoke of the modern world and the digital age and how people were craving authenticity and heritage. He used buzzwords like brand equity and vertical integration and influencer marketing, and the words sounded tinny and hollow, coming from his mouth like coins dropping into an empty jar. I listened, and I nodded, and I smelled the shift in the air. As he spoke, his body temperature rose slightly, and I could smell the change in his pheromones. It was a subtle sharpening of his scent, a transition from the stale tobacco to something more chemical and pungent. It was the smell of a rehearsed script. He was not speaking from the heart, he was reciting lines he had practiced in front of a mirror, or perhaps lines that had been fed to him by someone else. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table, and his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. He said that he wanted to relaunch the Mercer line. He said he had investors lined up who were ready to pour millions into the company, but they needed a figurehead. They needed me to be the face of the brand again, even if it was just in name only. Then came the trap. He reached into his leather bag, which he had kept by his feet throughout the entire meal, and he pulled out a sleek blue folder. He slid it across the polished wood of the table, and it stopped just inches from my plate. He told me it was just standard paperwork. He called it a limited power of attorney that would allow him to handle the boring administrative tasks and the negotiations with the suppliers so I wouldn't have to be bothered with the headaches of business. He smiled, and his teeth were very white and very straight, and his eyes crinkled at the corners, but the smile did not reach the pupils. I looked at the folder, and I did not touch it. The smell coming off him now was distinct. It was the scent of copper and old sweat. It was the smell of a gambler who has pushed all his chips into the middle of the table on a bad hand and is praying that nobody calls his bluff. I took a slow breath and I told him that I was retired for a reason. I told him that the Mercer legacy was safe in the history books and that I had no desire to see my name plastered on internet advertisements or sold in discount department stores. I pushed the folder back toward him with one finger. The change in the room was instant. The air grew cold. Gavin's smile froze in place, and for a second the charming nephew vanished, and I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated anger behind his eyes. It smelled like burning rubber. He laughed a short, dry sound and asked me if I was sure. He said I was turning down a fortune. He said I was being selfish. I stood up and began clearing the plates, and I told him that I was tired and that we could discuss his career plans another time, but that my answer regarding the legal papers would remain the same. He stayed at the table clutching the blue folder, and as I walked into the kitchen with the dirty dishes, I could feel his gaze boring into my back. I knew then that he would not give up. He had not come all this way for a signature. He had come for something else, something specific. And now that the diplomatic approach had failed, I knew he would try a different key to unlock my secrets. My house is old, and it speaks in a language of creaks and groans that only I understand. The stairs whimper when you step on the third riser, and the floorboards in the hallway sigh when the temperature drops at night. I have lived here long enough to filter out the settling of the foundation and the rattling of the window panes against the coastal wind. But at 2 a.m, I woke up to a sound that did not belong to the house. It was the soft, rhythmic scuff of shoes on hardwood. I lay still in my bed with the quilt pulled up to my chin, and I closed my eyes and focused all my attention on my nose. The air in my bedroom was cool and smelled of the dried lavender sachet I kept under my pillow and the faint salt dampness of the ocean fog outside. Then the drift came. It slid under my bedroom door like a snake. It was the smell of leather polish. Not the beeswax polish I used on the furniture downstairs, but a chemical synthetic polish, the kind used on cheap dress shoes. It was Gavin. He was moving down the hallway toward the north wing of the house. I knew exactly where he was going. The north wing housed my laboratory. It was a space I kept locked, not because it contained dangerous chemicals, but because it held the library of scents I had collected over a lifetime. It was a climate-controlled room filled with thousands of tiny glass vials labeled in my own handwriting. I heard the distinct click of the laboratory door handle. It was locked, of course. I kept the key on a chain around my neck even when I slept, a habit born of paranoia or perhaps intuition. There was a pause and then a faint metallic scratching sound. He was trying to pick the lock. I slipped out of bed and put on my robe. I did not turn on the lamp. I moved across the room in the dark, knowing the placement of every rug and chair by heart. I opened my bedroom door silently and stepped into the hallway. The scent was stronger now. Layered over the leather polish was the smell of frustration. It is a hot, prickly scent like dry dust on a light bulb. I crept down the hall, staying close to the wall where the floorboards were less likely to creak. I reached the corner and peered around it into the shadows of the north wing. Gavin was there. He was kneeling in front of the laboratory door, illuminated by the thin beam of a penlight he held in his teeth. He was fumbling with a set of tension wrenches. He wasn't looking for money or jewelry or the silver candlesticks in the dining room. He was trying to get into the place where I kept my formulas. I watched him for a full minute. I saw the way his hands shook slightly. I saw the sweat glistening on his forehead, even in the cool hallway. This was not the act of a curious relative wanting to see his aunt's hobby room. This was a targeted strike. He cursed softly under his breath, a sharp hissed word, and sat back on his heels, rubbing his face with his hands. He couldn't get in. The lock was an old, intricate mechanism imported from Italy, and it did not yield to amateurs. I stepped back into the shadows and let out a deliberate yawn, loud enough to carry down the hall, but soft enough to sound sleepy. The reaction was immediate. Gavin scrambled up, pocketing the tools and the light in one fluid motion. He froze, pressing his back against the wall, holding his breath. I walked slowly toward the bathroom, flipping the light switch in the hallway as I went. I squinted against the sudden brightness and pretended to be startled when I saw him standing there, looking like a deer caught in headlights. I asked him what he was doing up at this hour. He blinked rapidly, and the lie came out smooth and practiced. He said he was looking for the bathroom and got turned around in the dark. He said the house was a maze, and he was sorry if he woke me. I looked at the closed door of the laboratory just inches from his shoulder, and then I looked at him. I smelled the lie. It smelled like sulfur and burnt sugar. I smiled a tired grandmotherly smile and pointed him toward the bathroom, which was in the opposite direction. I told him to be careful, as the floorboards could be slippery. He thanked me and hurried away, his footsteps heavy and clumsy, now that the stealth was gone. I waited until I heard the bathroom door close and lock. Then I walked to the laboratory door. I checked the handle. It was still secure, but there were fresh scratches on the brass plate surrounding the keyhole. I touched the cold metal, and I knew. He wasn't going to stop. Tonight was a probe, a test of the defenses. He would try again, and next time, he wouldn't be so polite with his tools. I went back to my room, but I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the wind and formulated a plan. I needed help. I needed someone who knew the law and who knew how to fight wolves in sheep's clothing. I needed Elias. The next morning, the sky was a bruised shade of purple, and the rain was lashing against the windshield as I drove into town. I left Gavin sleeping in the guest room, or pretending to sleep, and I told him I was going to the market for fresh eggs. It was a lie, but a necessary one. I pulled into the parking lot of Sal's Diner, which was a chrome and neon relic clinging to the edge of the highway. The air inside smelled of burnt coffee and frying bacon and the damp wool of fishermen's coats. It was an assault on the senses for someone with a nose like mine. But it was the one place in town where I knew we would not be overheard. Elias Thorne was already sitting in the back booth. He looked like a man carved out of oak. He was 72 years old, with shoulders that were still broad beneath his tweed jacket, and a face that was lined with the geography of 1,000 legal battles. He smelled of old law books and peppermint tea and the dry comfort of pipe tobacco, even though he hadn't smoked in 20 years. He stood up when he saw me, and his eyes, which were usually sharp and cynical, softened in a way they only ever did for me. He took my hand and asked if I was all right, and I sat down and told him that I was far from all right. I ordered a black tea and waited for the waitress to leave before I leaned across the chipped formica table and told him everything. I told him about the smell of adrenaline on Gavin. I told him about the power of attorney documents. I told him about the lock-picking attempt in the middle of the night. Elias listened without interrupting. He held his mug with both hands and his jaw tightened with every sentence. When I finished, he didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. He reached into his briefcase, which was battered leather and older than Gavin himself. And he pulled out a thick envelope. He slid it across the table, avoiding the sticky ring left by a syrup dispenser. He told me that he had made some calls to a friend of his who used to work in Las Vegas. He told me that Gavin wasn't just a struggling entrepreneur. He was a drowning man. I opened the envelope and scanned the papers inside. They were printouts of bank statements and credit reports and police blotters. The numbers were staggering. Gavin owed over $200,000 to a private lending group in Nevada. The kind of lending group that didn't send overdue notices in the mail, but sent men with baseball bats to your door. Elias leaned forward and his voice was low and urgent. He said that Gavin was dangerous because he was desperate. He said that a man with that kind of debt would do anything to save his own skin. He advised me to go to the sheriff immediately and have Gavin removed from the property. He said he could have a restraining order typed up within the hour. The smell of the diner faded, and all I could smell was the ink on the paper in front of me. It smelled of cold, hard facts. I looked at Elias and shook my head. I told him that I couldn't kick Gavin out, not yet. Elias looked at me as if I had lost my mind. He asked me why on earth I would keep a viper in my nest. I explained that Gavin was incompetent. He was a clumsy thief who used cheap leather polish and got caught trying to pick a lock. If I kicked him out, he would report back to whoever he was working for. He would tell them he failed. And then the people he owed money to, the people who were really pulling the strings, might decide to send someone else. Someone who wasn't a clumsy nephew. Someone who wouldn't hesitate to hurt me to get what they wanted. I told Elias that I needed to know who the buyer was. I needed to know who was funding Gavin. I needed to know if they were after the money or if they were specifically after the Imperium formula. Elias sat back and sighed, and I could smell the frustration rolling off him like heat from a radiator. He hated it when I put myself in danger. He had spent 40 years trying to protect me from the world and from myself. He asked me what my plan was. I told him I was going to let Gavin think he was winning. I was going to let him think I was a confused old woman who was losing her grip on reality. I was going to give him enough rope to hang himself, and while he was busy trying to trick me, I was going to find out who was holding the other end of the leash. Elias stared at me for a long moment, and then a small, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He said that I was a stubborn woman. He said he would stay close and keep his phone on loud. I finished my tea and stood up. I told him to stay put and finish his breakfast. I had to get back to the house before Gavin woke up and realized the wolf was gone. The war for my sanity began not with a shout, but with a series of quiet displacements. When I returned from the diner, the house felt different. It was subtle, like the shift in air pressure before a thunderstorm. Gavin was sitting in the living room reading a magazine, and he looked up with a smile that was too bright and too wide. He asked if I had bought the eggs, and I told him the market was out of stock, which was a clumsy lie, but he didn't seem to notice. Over the next 2 days, small things began to migrate. My reading glasses, which I always kept on the side table by my armchair, appeared in the bathroom cabinet. The remote control for the television vanished only to be found hours later inside the linen closet. I knew exactly what was happening. I had seen enough bad movies to recognize the script. It was classic gaslighting. He was moving my possessions to make me doubt my memory. He wanted me to feel fragile. He wanted me to feel old. I played along. I furrowed my brow and apologized for my clumsiness and let him pat my hand with his clammy palms. I let him tell me that it was normal for people my age to start slipping. I let him use that patronizing voice that people reserve for toddlers and the infirm. But the real escalation happened on Thursday evening. I had gone upstairs to take a nap, leaving Gavin downstairs to watch the football game. I drifted into a light sleep, lulled by the sound of the wind rattling the window panes. I woke up to a smell that triggered a primal alarm in the reptilian part of my brain. It was the heavy, cloying stench of mercaptan, the chemical additive they put in natural gas so you know when there is a leak. It smelled like rotten eggs and impending death. I scrambled out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I rushed into the hallway, and the smell was stronger there, thick and suffocating. I ran down the stairs, shouting Gavin's name. He met me at the bottom of the stairs, looking frantic. He was holding a towel over his nose and mouth. He grabbed my shoulders and steered me toward the front door. He told me to get out. He said I had left the stove on. He said the pilot light was out and the kitchen was filling with gas. I stood on the porch, shivering in the cold evening air, while he ran back inside to open the windows and turn off the knobs. I wrapped my arms around myself and tried to steady my breathing. My mind was racing. I hadn't used the stove since lunch. I was certain I had turned it off. I was methodical in the kitchen. I was a chemist by trade, and safety protocols were ingrained in my DNA. But as I stood there, in the cold, doubt began to creep in. Had I forgotten? Was I really losing my mind? The fear was a cold knot in my stomach. Gavin came back out a few minutes later. He looked grave. He put a heavy arm around my shoulders and led me to the porch swing. He sat me down and looked me in the eye. He said that this was dangerous. He said that I could have blown the house up. He said that he had been worried about me for a few days now with the missing keys and the confusion. But this was different. This was life or death. He leaned in close, and his voice dropped to a whisper. He suggested that perhaps it wasn't safe for me to live alone in this big house anymore. He mentioned a lovely assisted living facility in Arizona, where the climate would be better for my joints, and where there were nurses to make sure I didn't hurt myself. For a moment, I almost believed him. I almost let the shame wash over me, but then the wind shifted. Gavin leaned back, and as he moved his hand from my shoulder, a faint scent drifted from his fingertips. It was masked by the overwhelming stench of the gas that still clung to his clothes, but my nose caught it. It was a sharp, industrial smell. Petroleum-based, viscous. It was machine oil, specifically the kind of spray lubricant you use to loosen rusted bolts. I looked at his hands. They were clean, but the scent was in the pores. I remembered the stove. The front right burner knob had been sticky for years. It required a firm grip and a hard twist to turn. It was impossible to nudge it open by accident. You had to mean it. Gavin hadn't just turned the knob. He had greased it first. He had sprayed lubricant into the mechanism to make it turn silently and smoothly so he could stage this little theater of terror. The fear in my stomach evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, hard rage. He was willing to risk blowing up my house. He was willing to risk our lives just to scare me into signing those papers. I looked at him and forced a trembling smile. I told him he was right. I told him I was terrified. I told him that maybe it was time to talk about the future. He squeezed my shoulder, and the relief on his face was palpable. He thought he had broken me. I let him lead me back inside the house once the air had cleared. I went to the kitchen to make tea, and while he was in the living room celebrating his victory, I leaned down and sniffed the stove knob. There it was, the unmistakable oily tang of WD-40. I stood up and filled the kettle. My hands were steady. I wasn't the one who needed to be worried about safety anymore. Gavin had just made a fatal error. He had introduced a foreign contaminant into my laboratory, and now I was going to make sure he paid for it. The house was quiet again, but it was a heavy and expectant silence like the air before a thunderclap. Gavin had gone into town, claiming he needed to pick up a prescription for his allergies, but I knew he was making a call to his handlers to report that the gaslight attempt had been a success. He thought I was broken and pliable and ready to be shipped off to Arizona, but while he was out celebrating his victory, I was walking into the heart of the mystery. I went to the library, which was a room lined floor to ceiling with books that smelled of vanilla and dust and the slow decay of paper. This had been my father's domain. Henri Mercer was a genius and a paranoid man who believed that safes could be cracked and digital files could be hacked. But he believed that the nose was the only true lock that could not be picked. He had told me once, when I was a girl, that his greatest creation, the Imperium formula, was not written down in ink. He said he had hidden it in the language of the air. I walked to the section of the shelves that held his journals. There were dozens of them bound in black leather that had cracked with age like dry skin. To anyone else, these were just incoherent ramblings about chemical compounds and harvest yields. But to me, they were a map. I pulled down the volume dated 1984, which was the year he claimed to have perfected the scent. I opened it to the middle of the book. The pages were blank. A normal person would have thrown the book away or assumed the ink had faded, but I knew better. My father used sympathetic inks that did not react to heat or light, but to friction and specific chemical triggers. I brought the book up to my face, and I pressed my thumb hard against the grain of the paper and rubbed it in a circular motion. The friction warmed the fibers and broke the microscopic capsules embedded in the page. I closed my eyes and inhaled. The first note was sharp and green. Galbanum. It was the scent of snapped stems and wet earth. It meant roots or foundation. I rubbed the next page. This one released a heavy powdery scent. Orris root. It was the smell of old makeup and dried violets. It represented beauty or vanity. I turned the page again and rubbed harder. The third scent was jarring. It was not a perfume ingredient at all. It was the smell of cold iron and rust. Galbanum, orris, iron, roots, vanity, metal. I stood there in the silent library and let the scents swirl in my mind, trying to construct the sentence my father had left for me. The root of vanity is iron. The foundation of beauty is metal. I paced the room, muttering the scents aloud. It was a riddle of location. I had to find an object in this house that matched that profile. My eyes scanned the room. The brass lamps? No, that was copper and zinc, not iron. The fireplace grate? Too obvious. Then I remembered. My mother had a dressing table in the master suite, which I had converted into a guest room years ago. On that table sat a collection of antique atomizers. One of them was a heavy Victorian piece made of cast iron filigree wrapped around a bulb of purple glass. The purple glass was the color of the iris flower which gives us orris root, the iron iris. My heart stopped. The master suite, the guest room. That was the room where Gavin was sleeping. The formula wasn't in the library, and it wasn't in my laboratory. It was sitting on the dresser 3 feet from where my nephew laid his head every night. He had been sleeping next to a fortune worth millions, and he didn't even know it. I heard the front door open downstairs. The heavy thud of Gavin's footsteps echoed in the foyer. He was back early. I shoved the journal back onto the shelf and smoothed my hair. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath. I needed to be calm. I needed to be the confused old aunt. I walked out of the library and met him in the hallway. He looked at me with that fake concern that made my skin crawl and asked what I was doing. I told him I was looking for a photo album to show him. I told him I wanted to reminisce about the good old days. He smiled, and it was a wolfish smile. He said we would have plenty of time for that later. He said he had a surprise for me. He said a friend of his was in town and wanted to stop by to meet the legendary Helena Mercer. I smelled the excitement on him again. It was the smell of a deal closing. I realized then that I was running out of time. The formula was in his room, and his friend was coming to take it. I had to get into that room and retrieve the atomizer before the trap snapped shut. The doorbell rang at 4 o'clock precisely, and the sound echoed through the house like a gavel striking a judge's bench. Gavin practically tripped over his own feet, rushing to answer it. He smoothed his sweater and ran a hand through his hair and checked his reflection in the hallway mirror, with the nervous vanity of a man who is about to sell his soul and wants to look good doing it. I stood at the top of the stairs for a moment watching him. I needed to compose myself. I needed to slow my heart rate because a fast pulse warms the skin and changes the scent of the body, and I did not want to smell like fear. I wanted to smell like lavender and old lace. I wanted to smell harmless. I walked down the stairs, slowly gripping the banister as Gavin opened the heavy oak door. Standing on the porch was a woman who looked as if she had been cut from a sheet of steel. She was tall and thin, with hair the color of polished obsidian cut into a sharp bob that angled across her cheekbones. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was tailored to within an inch of its life, and she held a slim black briefcase in a hand that ended in blood-red manicured nails. Gavin introduced her as Ms. Hart. He called her a consultant who specialized in estate management and legacy preservation. He said she was here to help us appraise the value of the Mercer brand. I reached out to shake her hand. Her skin was cool and dry like parchment paper. And then the scent hit me. It was subtle and sophisticated, but to a nose like mine, it was as loud as a siren. It was a perfume called Cœur de Glace, Heart of Ice. It was a scent characterized by a heavy dose of synthetic aldehydes and a base of white musk and chill metallic notes. It was not sold in stores. It was a private blend created exclusively for the senior executives of Vane & Co. My blood ran cold. Vane & Co. was not just a competitor. They were a corporate predator. They were a massive conglomerate that bought up historic perfume houses, stripped them of their assets, fired the artisans, and mass-produced cheap, watered-down versions of the original scents using synthetic substitutes. They were the reason the art of perfumery was dying. 30 years ago, they had tried to buy my father out. He had thrown their representative off the property. Now they were back, and they had found a weak link in the chain. They had found Gavin. I realized then that this wasn't just about Gavin paying off his gambling debts. This was corporate espionage. Vane & Co. had been hunting for the Imperium formula for decades. They knew it existed, and they knew it was the one scent that could legitimize their synthetic empire. Ms. Hart smiled at me, and her eyes were flat and assessing. She told me it was an honor to meet me. She said she had heard so much about my charming home. I led them into the living room and offered tea, which Ms. Hart declined. She wanted to get straight to business. She sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her back perfectly straight, and opened her briefcase. She didn't pull out appraisal forms. She pulled out a contract. She started talking about strategic partnerships and asset liquidation. She used soft words to describe a hostile takeover. She looked at Gavin, and he nodded along like a bobblehead doll eager to please the woman who held his financial lifeline. I sat in my armchair and played the part of the doting aunt. I nodded vaguely and asked questions that made me sound confused. I asked if they were going to sell my jams at the county fair. I asked if this meant I had to move my garden. Ms. Hart exchanged a look with Gavin. A look of impatience. A look that said, "How long do we have to humor her?" Gavin leaned forward and patted my knee. He told me not to worry about the details. He said Ms. Hart just needed to see the inventory to make a proper assessment. He meant the laboratory. My heart hammered against my ribs. If they went into the lab, they wouldn't find the formula, but they would see that the archives were empty. They would know I was hiding something, and if they started tearing the house apart looking for it, they would eventually end up in the guest room. They would end up near the iron iris. I needed to get them out of the house, or at least distract them long enough for me to get upstairs. I stood up slowly, clutching my chest. I let out a soft gasp. I told them I was feeling a bit faint. I told them the excitement was too much for me. I swayed slightly on my feet. Gavin jumped up, his face flushing with a mix of annoyance and panic. Ms. Hart didn't move. She just watched me with those cold, predatory eyes, sniffing the air for the scent of weakness. I knew I had to sell the performance. I had to make them believe that the only thing standing between them and the formula was a frail, old woman's failing heart. Because if they thought I was dying, they might get careless. And carelessness creates openings. I have never been an actress. I am a woman of science, of precise measurements and chemical reactions. But survival is a powerful teacher, and as I clutched the fabric of my blouse and let my knees buckle, I committed to the performance of a lifetime. I crumbled to the Persian rug not with a heavy thud, but with a slow, terrifying slide. I let my eyelids flutter and forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. "Aunt Helena!" Gavin's voice cracked. He dropped the contract he was holding and scrambled to my side. I looked up through half-closed eyes. I could see Ms. Hart standing over us. She didn't look concerned. She looked annoyed. She checked her wristwatch, a gesture so cold it almost made me break character. "Call 911, Ms. Hart said, her voice flat. "We can't have her dying before the signature is on the page." Gavin pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling. I smelled a new note in his scent profile: wet wool and sour milk. It was the smell of a man realizing his golden goose was about to expire before laying the egg. I lay on the floor and focused on my breathing, making it sound wheezy. Within 10 minutes, the room was filled with the chaotic noise of static radios and heavy boots. 2 paramedics burst in, bringing with them the sharp, sterile smells of rubbing alcohol, latex, and the damp ozone of the rain outside. Gavin immediately launched into the role of the distraught nephew. He told them I had been confused lately, that I was under a lot of stress. He hovered over the paramedics, wringing his hands, trying to look like a guardian angel while casting nervous glances at Ms. Hart, who had retreated to the corner like a shadow. One of the paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes and hands that smelled of peppermint soap, placed a blood pressure cuff on my arm. "Mrs. Mercer, can you hear me?" she asked. I nodded weakly. "My chest," I whispered. "It feels tight." "Her pulse is racing," the paramedic said to her partner. "We should take her in for observation." "No," I gasped, gripping the paramedic's arm with surprising strength. "No hospital. I want to stay in my home." "Aunt Helena, please," Gavin pleaded. "You need a doctor." "I need my lawyer," I rasped. "I need Elias." Gavin froze. I saw the gears turning in his head. If I was dying, he needed to make sure the will was in order. He needed to make sure he was the beneficiary. If calling Elias made me happy, it might speed up the process. "Give me my phone," I demanded, my voice trembling. Gavin fumbled in his pocket, He had taken my phone earlier for safekeeping and pressed it into my hand. I dialed the number by feel, my thumb finding the familiar buttons. Elias picked up on the first ring. "Helena?" I brought the phone to my ear, shielding my mouth with my hand as if I were coughing. "Elias?" I whispered, loud enough for Gavin to hear the name, but soft enough to hide the tone. "I'm having an episode. Gavin is here, and a woman." Then I dropped my voice to a breath, speaking directly into the microphone. "The garden is infested. The pests are vain. Bring the pesticide." It was a code we had established years ago, a joke about my obsession with my plants, but the meaning was clear. Intruders. Serious danger. Bring the sheriff. "I'm on my way," Elias said, his voice turning into granite. "Stall them." I let the phone slip from my fingers and closed my eyes. "He's coming," I mumbled. The paramedics spent the next 20 minutes stabilizing me. They determined that while my heart rate was elevated, I wasn't in immediate cardiac arrest. They strongly advised transport, but I refused with the stubbornness of the elderly. In Oregon, you cannot force a conscious patient into an ambulance against their will. Eventually, they packed up their gear. They made Gavin sign a release form stating he would watch me. As the door closed behind them, the house fell silent again, but the dynamic had shifted. I lay on the sofa, covered in a blanket. Ms. Hart stepped out of the shadows. She walked over to me and leaned down. Her scent, that icy metallic musk, was overpowering now. "That was a very dramatic performance, Mrs. Mercer," she said softly. "But delaying the inevitable only makes it painful. We are not leaving until we get what we came for." She looked at Gavin. "Search the house. Start with the library. Tear the drywall down if you have to. I want that formula." Gavin looked at me, then at the stairs. He looked torn between playing the nursemaid and obeying his master. Greed won. He turned and headed for the library. I watched him go, my heart pounding for real this time. He was going to the wrong room. That bought me time. But Elias was 20 minutes away. I had to move. I had to get to the guest room before they realized the library was empty. Ms. Hart was pacing in the foyer, her heels clicking a sharp, impatient rhythm on the hardwood. She was on her phone, speaking in low, rapid-fire French, a corporate dialect I knew well, filled with terms of acquisition and hostile leverage. She was so confident in her victory, so sure that I was a broken, dying woman cowering on the sofa, that she didn't bother to watch me. This was her mistake. Arrogance has a scent. It smells like ozone, cold, airy, and blindingly bright. It makes you blind to the shadows. I waited until she turned her back to gaze out the window at the rain. Then I moved. I didn't head for the front door. I slipped off the sofa and moved silently toward the narrow service staircase behind the kitchen. My joints screamed in protest, but adrenaline is a potent painkiller. I climbed the stairs in my stocking feet, skipping the third step, which always groaned, and emerged on the second-floor landing. Down the hall, I could hear crashing sounds coming from the library. Gavin was tearing the room apart. I heard books hitting the floor, shelves being rattled. The desperation in his search was palpable. He was looking for a safe, a hollowed-out book, a loose floorboard. He was looking everywhere except where he slept. I slipped into the guest room, Gavin's room, and closed the door softly behind me. The room smelled of him. It was a chaotic mix of stale laundry, the metallic tang of loose change scattered on the dresser, and the sour underlying note of a man living in fear. I moved to the dressing table. There it was, the iron iris. It sat among a clutter of Gavin's receipts and empty coffee cups, a beautiful relic of a more elegant time. The purple glass bulb was encased in black iron filigree. My father had designed it with a specific mechanism. It wasn't just a perfume bottle. It was a vault. I gripped the iron nozzle and twisted it counterclockwise, pressing down simultaneously. It was a movement that required specific knowledge, like opening a child-proof cap, but far more delicate. There was a soft click, and the atomizer head detached from the glass bulb. Inside the glass, floating in a small amount of amber liquid, was a tiny, sealed glass ampule. I fished it out with a pair of tweezers from my pocket. I held it up to the light. Inside the ampule was a tightly rolled strip of vellum paper, the Imperium formula. I slipped the ampule into the hidden pocket of my skirt. Now, I needed the bait. I couldn't leave the atomizer empty. If Gavin found it empty, he would keep tearing the house apart until he found me. I needed him to think he had won. I needed him to stop looking. I grabbed a piece of heavy stationery from the bedside table. I pulled a pen from my pocket. My hand hovered over the paper. I needed a formula that looked convincing to a layman, but would be disastrous to a nose. I thought back to my early days in chemistry class. I wrote down a sequence of chemical compounds. Indole, civitone, 4-methyl-3-hexanoic acid. To an untrained eye, they looked like legitimate perfume ingredients. Indole is found in jasmine. Civitone is a classic musk. But in the proportions I wrote down, without the balancing agents, the result would not be the scent of empire. It would smell of wet dog, fecal matter, and rotting cabbage. I rolled the paper tightly, mimicking the shape of the original scroll. I dropped it into the purple glass bulb and screwed the iron nozzle back into place. I placed the atomizer back on the dresser, exactly where it had been, but turned slightly to the left. A subtle invitation. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, angry footsteps. Gavin was coming back. I had seconds. There was no time to get back to the service stairs. I looked around the room. The closet was too cliché. Under the bed was impossible for my knees. I spotted the ensuite bathroom. I darted inside and pulled the door almost shut, leaving a sliver of a crack. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run loud and fast, and splashed water on my face. The bedroom door banged open. "Where is it?" Gavin muttered to himself. "Where would the old bat hide it?" I peered through the crack. Gavin was standing in the middle of the room, breathing hard. He looked wild. He began yanking drawers open, dumping his own clothes onto the floor. Then he stopped. He looked at the dressing table. He looked at the mess he had made, and then his eyes landed on the only thing in the room that was still stillness and grace. The iron iris. He walked over to it slowly. He picked it up. He shook it. He heard the rattle of the paper inside. I held my breath, the water running in the sink masking the sound of my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched through the sliver of the bathroom door as Gavin wrestled with the iron iris. He did not have the gentle touch of a collector. He twisted the delicate iron filigree with brute force, and I heard the sickening snap of metal giving way. It broke my heart to hear the antique damaged, but it was a necessary sacrifice for the greater trap. He shook the bottle upside down, and the rolled paper slid out into his palm. The silence in the room was absolute save for the rushing water in the sink behind me. Gavin unrolled the paper with trembling fingers. He held it up to the light, squinting at my handwriting. I saw his lips move as he sounded out the words. Indole, civitone. To him, these were just expensive scientific terms. He had no idea that he was looking at a recipe for liquid filth. He saw complexity, and he assumed value. A slow, arrogant smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who believes he has just won the lottery. He laughed a short, sharp bark of triumph that made me flinch. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and laid the paper flat on the dresser, smoothing out the edges. He snapped picture after picture, ensuring every chemical compound was legible. He was securing his insurance policy. Then, he dialed a number. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own phone. I tapped the screen with a damp finger and opened the voice memo app. I hit record and held the phone up to the crack in the door. Gavin paced the room, phone pressed to his ear. The scent of him had changed again. The fear was gone, replaced by a swaggering musk of testosterone and cheap victory. He spoke to the person on the other end. He told them he had the formula. He told them it was verified. He told them to get the wire transfer ready. Then came the words that sealed his fate. He laughed into the phone and said that the old woman was not a problem anymore. He said he had made arrangements with the facility in Arizona. He said they could come collect me in the morning. He said that once I was declared incompetent and locked away, he would liquidate the estate and sell the land to developers. My hand tightened around the phone until my knuckles turned white. He wasn't just stealing my legacy. He was stealing my life. He was planning to erase me from my own home to pave over my garden for a quick payout. He hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, breathing heavily. He looked around the room one last time with a look of ownership. He picked up the fake formula and shoved it into his pocket. He turned to leave the room. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade down the hallway. I turned off the faucet and the silence rushed back in, ringing in my ears. I stopped the recording and saved the file. I stepped out of the bathroom. The room felt violated. My father's atomizer lay broken on the dresser, a casualty of greed. I picked up the pieces of the twisted iron and held them for a moment. I walked to the window and looked down at the driveway. Through the rain and the gathering dusk, I saw the headlights of a car turning onto the property. It was a sturdy, sensible sedan. Elias. He had arrived. I checked my phone. The recording was 2 minutes long. It was clear. It was damning. It was the evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. I didn't feel frail anymore. I didn't feel like the victim. I felt the cold clarity of a scientist who has just isolated a pathogen and is preparing the cure. I smoothed my skirt and checked my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were bright and hard. I walked out of the room and headed for the stairs. It was time to go down and finish this. The play was over. The actors were all on stage, and I was about to drop the curtain. I walked down the stairs, and I did not hold the banister. I did not stoop. I did not shuffle. I walked with the spine of a woman who has spent 40 years commanding laboratories and boardrooms. Down in the foyer, Gavin and Ms. Hart were standing by the door. Gavin had his leather bag slung over his shoulder, and he looked like a man who had just finished a marathon and won gold. He was beaming. Ms. Hart was checking her phone again, probably calculating her commission. They looked up when they heard my footsteps. Gavin's smile faltered. He looked confused. He was expecting a frail invalid gasping for breath on the sofa, not the matriarch descending from on high. He asked me what I was doing out of bed. He told me I needed to save my strength for the journey tomorrow. I stopped on the bottom step, so I was eye level with him. I told him there would be no journey. I told him he had overstayed his welcome. Ms. Hart narrowed her eyes. She smelled the shift in the air instantly. She smelled the danger. She snapped her briefcase shut and took a step toward the door. But the door opened before she could reach it. Elias Thorne stepped inside, and he brought the storm with him. The wind and rain swept into the hallway, swirling around him like a cape. Behind him stood Sheriff Miller, a large man who smelled of wet wool and gun oil. Gavin took a step back, his face draining of color. He demanded to know what was going on. He tried to puff out his chest and play the outraged homeowner. He asked Elias who he thought he was bursting in like this. Elias didn't say a word. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen and held it up. My voice filled the silent hallway, clear and sharp from the recording I had sent to Elias just minutes ago. Then came Gavin's voice. The old woman is not a problem anymore. Once she's declared incompetent and locked away, liquidate the estate, sell the land. The color didn't just drain from Gavin's face, it vanished, leaving him looking like gray putty. He looked at the phone, then at me, then at the sheriff. The smell coming off him now was pungent and acrid. It was the smell of total collapse. Ms. Hart moved instantly. She was a survivor. She looked at Gavin with pure disgust, not because of what he had done, but because he had been caught. She turned to the sheriff and stated clearly that she was merely a consultant and had no knowledge of Mr. Mercer's personal plans regarding his aunt. She claimed she was there strictly for a preliminary valuation. I stepped forward and looked her in the eye. I told her that attempted corporate espionage was a federal crime. I told her that if she ever stepped foot on my property or near my company again, I would release the security footage of her pressuring a woman she believed to be having a heart attack. Ms. Hart didn't blink. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and walked out the door into the rain without looking back. She left Gavin standing there alone. Gavin turned to me, his hands shaking. He tried to stammer an excuse. He tried to say it was just talk. He tried to call me Aunt Helena again. I raised my hand and silenced him. I told him that family is not blood. Family is behavior. I told him that he had come into my sanctuary and tried to poison it with his greed. I told him to leave. The sheriff stepped forward and put a heavy hand on Gavin's shoulder. He told Gavin that they needed to have a conversation down at the station about the gas leak and the attempted fraud. Gavin looked at me one last time. There was no charm left, no arrogance, just a scared boy who had played a man's game and lost. He was led out into the rain, his expensive loafers squelching in the mud. Elias closed the door, and the silence returned to the house. But it wasn't the heavy silence of waiting. It was the clean silence of peace. He looked at me and smiled, and his eyes were warm. He asked if I was all right. I took a deep breath. I smelled the rain and the wood polish and the faint lingering scent of lavender. I smelled my home. I told him I was better than all right. I told him I was free. The red taillights of the sheriff's cruiser faded into the mist, and the heavy silence of the Oregon coast reclaimed my driveway. The storm that had raged all afternoon was breaking apart, and the moon was fighting its way through the clouds, casting a pale silver light on the wet gravel. I turned back to the house. It looked different to me now. For the last week, it had felt like a fortress under siege, a place of shadows and suspicion, where every creak of the floorboards was a threat. But now, as I walked back into the warmth of the hallway, it felt like a home again. It smelled of lemon polish and old wood, and the lingering trace of Elias's pipe tobacco clinging to his coat. We went into the living room where the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Elias knelt on the hearth and added a fresh log, and the flames leaped up with a crackle that sounded like applause. He went to the kitchen and returned with 2 mugs of Earl Grey tea, steaming and fragrant, with the scent of bergamot. We sat in the armchairs facing the fire, and for a long time we didn't speak. We just let the warmth seep into our bones and washed away the cold tension of the confrontation. Elias took a sip of his tea and looked at me over the rim of the mug. His eyes were kind and tired and filled with a question he hadn't asked yet. He asked me what was in the atomizer. He asked if Gavin really had the formula. I reached into the deep pocket of my skirt and pulled out the small glass ampule. It caught the firelight and glowed like a trapped star. I told him that Gavin had a recipe for a stink bomb that would make him the laughingstock of the industry if he ever tried to brew it. I held the real formula in my hand. It was a piece of vellum no larger than a cigarette paper. It was the culmination of my father's life work. It was the scent of empire. It was worth millions of dollars. It was the reason my nephew had betrayed his blood, and the reason a corporate shark had circled my home. I looked at the paper, and then I looked at the fire. I uncorked the ampule and used a pair of tweezers to pull the rolled paper out. It uncurled slightly in the heat of the room. I could smell the faint ghost of the ink my father had used. Elias sat forward. He asked me what I was going to do with it. He said I could sell it on my own terms now. I could donate the money. I could secure my future forever. I shook my head. I told him that some things are too heavy to carry. I told him that as long as this formula existed, there would always be wolves. There would always be greed. There would always be someone willing to break a lock or break a heart to possess it. I wanted my life back. I wanted to prune my lavender in peace. I wanted to drink tea with my friend without looking over my shoulder. I leaned forward and tossed the paper into the fire. It didn't burn like normal paper. Because of the chemical treatment in the ink, it flared up with a brilliant blue light for a split second. A puff of smoke rose up the chimney, and for a brief moment, the room was filled with a scent that was indescribably beautiful. It smelled of gold and sunlight and absolute power. And then, it was gone. The paper curled into black ash and crumbled into the gray bed of the fire. Elias watched it go, and then he looked at me and smiled. He raised his mug in a silent toast. I sat back in my chair and took a deep breath. The house smelled of tea and wood smoke and the clean, damp air of the ocean. It was an ordinary smell. It was a humble smell. But to me, it was the sweetest perfume in the world. It was the scent of freedom. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. If you held a secret worth millions, but it brought danger to your doorstep, would you keep it, or would you burn it like I did? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.